Okay, today we are going to talk a little bit about surplus labor value and the ways in which a capitalist might interpret where surplus labor value goes and how a Marxist interprets where surplus labor value goes. So before we discuss that, we need to talk about the labor theory of value just a tidbit. Um, David Ricardo theorized or came up with the idea that all value that is created through labor. And so, let's say there's a lumberjack. Through his labor of chopping down the tree and creating the firewood, he adds value through his labor to the tree and turns it into wood. And its commodity price that eventually gets spit out is a reflection of the value of his labor. So all labor has some sort of value. And the two values, what we need to talk about is subsistence labor value and surplus labor value. Okay, all the value of labor up until the point which is required to sustain the worker and also replace the worker is subsistence labor value. If you pay a worker a wage below this, then the job will necessarily have to disappear because the worker will either move to a different job or starve to death, or what have you, not be able to survive on such a job. So the job will disappear if it's below subsistence. And then above subsistence is surplus labor value. So this is all the labor value that's in excess of the subsistence labor value up into the point where you hit the cap of the total labor value, what the actual value of the labor is to society or what have you. So when you're engaging in capitalism, what happens is the capitalist has capital, and what they need is labor, and so they hire workers to work as labor, and with the expectation that both of them are going to profit in some way, right? And so the capitalist, whenever the capitalist is hiring someone, it is impossible for the capitalist to pay the actual value of labor or above the actual value of labor. Because if they do this, their capitalistic endeavor is not sustainable. They will be beaten by other companies that don't do this and therefore have more revenue to reinvest into the company. And so the capitalist can't pay the total or the actual value of the labor. So, somewhere in the band of surplus labor value, that has to be where the wage actually occurs. Because if you pay above total or actual value of labor, then the capitalist will destroy themselves. And if you pay below subsistence, the worker will destroy themselves. So the actual wage has to be somewhere in the middle, and somewhere along the surplus labor value, somewhere in there. With the capitalist, the central argument of capitalism, or how capitalism would interpret where the surplus labor value goes, is that there's an equilibrium. There is a market. In the market, there are sellers of labor, right? And then there are buyers of labor, right? The sellers of labor are the capitalists. Or no, sorry. The sellers of labor are the workers, and the buyers of labor are the capitalists. There's a supply and a demand curve, and somewhere along there, there's an equilibrium point where an optimal amount of labor is provided and the same amount of labor is bought. And the idea of the capitalist is that that's going to end up being somewhere close to the middle, and the laborer is going to get some value in excess of what is required to keep them alive, and the capitalist is also going to get some value as a consequence of their contributed capital, and everything seems fair. The Marxist disagrees with this sort of logic. The Marxist would argue that there is an excess of labor, and what the excess of labor does is it allows capitalists to offer wages that are lower and lower until they approach subsistence, And what this means is that the share of the pie of the surplus labor value, the pie that can be shared, because obviously you can't share the subsistence portion, otherwise the workers die. Their argument is that the capitalist takes, eventually, will be taking this entire pie, or close to it. And their argument is one that goes a little bit like the if you were to reinterpret it into a more capitalistic terms, it would be something along the lines of the workers are price takers, and the sheer volume of labor is such that the workers cannot set prices, and the capitalists, just by having such great availability, just get to push down the price of labor all the way until it is roughly at subsistence. So, keeping these two things in mind is important if you're communicating with someone who occupies one of these particular paradigms, because the capitalist argument, the way it shakes out visually, if you look at the picture, is that it's very fair. The worker is splitting the extra value that the worker is creating with the capitalist. They both need to get something out of it, and they both do. The Marxist argument is that there is severe exploitation occurring. Now, both of these are kind of gross oversimplifications of what's likely occurring out there in the real world. There's a lot of labor where it just pays across the world, like thinking globally, where it just pays really close to subsistence. And in those instances, the Marxist argument seems to be, of what's going on, seems to be accurate. If people are making pennies to assemble stuff in sweatshops, that seems to be the case, that the capitalist is getting all of the surplus labor value. Conversely, with highly skilled jobs and highly technical jobs, the capitalist argument seems to make more sense in that there isn't an excess of labor in the same way there is for unskilled tasks. And so the capitalist can't push it down because there is a greater demand relative to supply for labor of highly specialized kind. So they have more ability to not be price takers, instead be price setters. And so the capitalist argument, or the model of how they would argue where the surplus labor value goes, that model seems more accurate in the case of specialized and highly technical fields. So if you are talking to someone who is far left and is talking about exploitation, it's likely that they're talking about the lower rungs of society that are getting exploited, or their model is such that everyone's getting exploited, which that might be their model. And if you're talking to someone who is very into markets and the capitalist type of argument, which I think most of the people in the U.S. probably are, their assumption is going to be such that you have some say over how much you get paid, and the standard U.S. argument is if you have to make yourself valuable. Or not U.S. argument, but the capitalistic sort of argument, so that you can be a price giver, not a price taker. So you have to acquire skill, which makes sense. Anyways, hope this was interesting.